I think I've discovered Apple's most exciting announcement of this year. So traditionally, making music involves this kind of setup. You'll have a great big MIDI controller keyboard, a monitor, a Mac running Logic Pro, then you'll have plugins, soft synths, and all that stuff needs updating, maintaining, booting up. It's a bit of a faff. It's something I've done for many, many, many years since I was a kid. The older you get, the more things that happen in your life, the more responsibilities you get. Keeping up this kind of hobby it's draining, to be honest. Now you can do all of this stuff pretty much on this. So, rather unexpectedly, Apple has launched Logic Pro on the iPad. Now, they've done the same thing with Final Cut Pro. I've made my feelings known about that. I'll link to that video in the description. Logic Pro is a different beast. However, I do want to give you my reaction as someone who has been making music personally and in his bedroom since he was about 12 years old. This stuff means an awful lot to me. And I know Logic Pro on the Mac like the back of my hand. So this has a lot to live up to, and the good news is it really does. And then some. Before I get stuck into this, just a very quick word from today's sponsor, which is Paperlike. And Paperlike has a brand new product called the Folio. And this is designed to give your iPad the look and feel of your favorite notebook. So it's got this lovely exterior material that really does feel like a professional notebook, but it also protects your iPad from scuffs and scratches. It's really lightweight as well, so perfect for carrying about anywhere. This Folio is perfect for writers, note takers, productivity enthusiasts, and every kind of digital artist. So the inside is coated with microfiber to gently keep your iPad display safe, and every edge is sealed with what's called a soft touch finish, which is a procedure for longevity, and it's usually reserved for high quality leather belts and wallets. The Paperlike Folio also has 2 positions of tilt, all of which are magnetized, and it supports the iPad's auto wake sleep feature. But the cherry on top, and my personal favorite feature of the Folio, is the fact that it holds your Apple Pencil in place. The Paperlike Folio is compatible with the latest iPad Air and both sized iPad Pros. To find out more, just click that link in the description. So when you open Logic Pro on the iPad for the first time, you're reminded, just like Final Cut Pro, that this is a subscription model. You can try it free for 30 days, which is great, but if you want to carry on using it, it's $4.99 a month or £49 a year. I've made my feelings known on this, and I think it's an absolute bargain. And Logic Pro on the iPad is just like Final Cut Pro in the way that it kind of eases you in. So you can start with a completely blank project, or you can be guided in with templates and tutorials. So you can jump into a live loop session, you can head straight into a blank timeline, or you can gain a head start with one of the many genre-specific live loops grids. There's also a gentle nudge into the sound packs library, which is full of loops, samples, patches, and some of them come from very big name producers. There's tons of them, and that's another reason I think this thing is a bargain, because all of that stuff is free. And yes, technically you can dive straight in and start making music on the iPad on its own, but there's a reason this stuff is in front of me. The first thing you'll need is a pair of wired headphones, because the latency, if you're using, let's say, AirPods Max, which some people are using in Apple's promo material, but if you use these in conjunction with your iPad for Logic Pro, if you press a note on a keyboard or on the screen, it will take a fraction of a second to reach these, which does mean you need a dongle. Thankfully, Apple does make a USB-C to 3.5mm jack dongle. Once you've got that, you'll then need a dongle for the iPad. So I've got a Ugreen dongle here. I'll put links to all this stuff in the description, but basically I have a Ugreen dongle that goes into the USB-C port on the iPad, and then into the dongle I have that adapter for the headphones, I have power going into it, and then I have another USB-A connection here to this MIDI controller keyboard. This is the Novation Launch Key Mini. It's featured on Apple's Logic Pro for iPad website, which is why I went for it, but it's a fantastic bit of kit, really well made, not particularly expensive, and you get traditional keys, but also pads and knobs and things to play around with. And as you've probably noticed, I've also got the Magic Keyboard attached to the iPad. So altogether, it's quite a setup, but it's still much smaller, more convenient, and plug and play than that lot over there. But what's it like to make music on Logic Pro for the iPad? Well, just like Final Cut Pro, it looks and feels familiar, but it's noticeably different. And the reason for that is because Apple has redesigned this from the ground up for the iPad and specifically for the Apple Pencil and your finger. A lot of the screens will feel very familiar, so you still have the live loop section, you have the traditional timeline, and you also have the mixer. There are just a few things that threw me and took a bit of getting used to. So for instance, on the live loop screen, we get these 4 controls at the top, which are trigger, cue, record, and edit. Now these change what the mouse pointer or your finger or the Apple Pencil does basically. So if I'm in trigger mode, that means I can trigger these loops, but if I want to edit them, I have to go over to edit and then go in and start editing them. If I want to record, I have to go up to record. So you're constantly kind of going up to that part of the screen, changing what you want to do, doing what you want to do, going back to those little controls. That is a little bit long-winded. The other thing that is a bit strange at first, but starts to make sense when you start using it, is the fact that the entire interface is stacked. So for instance, if I want to edit one of these live loops, I choose the live loop, I then press the pencil button at the bottom, and that brings up the piano roll, which is just another window, but it's, like I say, it's kind of stacked, so I can still see the live loops above and then the piano roll beneath. If I want to then modify or amend the instrument or the sample, I press the middle button at the bottom, and that gives me the, I guess, the kind of setup for the instrument or the sample, and again, it's kind of stacked beneath the piano roll. So I've now got the live loop still at the top, I've got the piano roll in the middle, and I've now got my little control for the sample at the bottom. Now you can get rid of these stacked windows at any stage just by pressing the little control at the top right and dragging it down. That gets rid of it, and you can expand them if you want to as well. So if I go into the mixer, I can just press that control and it makes the mixer full screen. This is nothing like the Mac version, which does have some stacked elements to it, but most of the Mac version is based on Windows. You don't get that in Logic Pro on the iPad. It doesn't use Windows for anything. Everything you do is embedded within the display. So for instance, if I bring up the inspect window, that shoves everything to the right hand side, and I can still then bring up things like the piano roll, but again it starts stacking it within that right hand frame. Even explaining this is pretty tricky, and if you're watching this for the first time, you might be thinking this is just way too complicated, but trust me, the more you use this, the more it makes sense. The other thing that threw me was how to choose a new instrument. So what you do is create a new track like this. You get 4 options here. You get MIDI, audio, pattern, or drummer. If I choose MIDI, that creates the new track, and it took me ages to work it out, but what you do is at the bottom, press the middle button, and then you get this little stack here that says MIDI effects, instrument, and audio effects. Now, anyone who has used Ableton will recognize this. This is very, very similar to Ableton. And what you basically do is press instrument. This is where you get the list of instruments. So I can choose Alchemy, for instance. And then to that, I can add MIDI effects on the left-hand side. So an arpeggiator, for instance. And on the right-hand side, I can add delay designer, and you can keep adding things into that chain. So again, it's very different to what you do on the Mac, but after a while it starts to make sense. The other great thing they've done on the iPad is create these kind of toned down versions of the instruments and the effects. So for Alchemy, for instance, you just get these controls for the type of sound, but if I press Alchemy, that takes me into the proper Alchemy synth. This gives me loads more controls, but equally I can press the default preset, and that gives me the presets for that instrument. Alchemy is a massive synth, and interestingly, you don't get as many presets on the iPad version as you do on the Mac version. That is a bit of a shame, but they do need to start somewhere, and we must remember that this is completely round trippable, which means you can take this project from the iPad, load it up on the Mac, and carry on working on the Mac version, and if we want to, take it from the Mac and put it back on the iPad, and it will still work. You can't do that with Final Cut Pro. Logic Pro on the iPad is very different to the Mac version for all sorts of reasons, but it's familiar enough, and after a while, obvious enough to not be a problem. It probably took me a couple of hours to really get my head around how this thing works. And once I'd done that, I realized that this really is Logic Pro. One of the biggest fears that I had about Logic Pro for the iPad was that it was going to be some kind of cut-down version of the thing that I know and love. The lack of external storage support on Final Cut Pro for the iPad is a complete showstopper for me. The good news is that I haven't found a single showstopper yet on Logic Pro for the iPad. And that's kind of the point. I think for a lot of people, they won't need a Mac running Logic Pro. This will be enough. And it even supports third-party plugins. The other thing to mention is that this thing absolutely flies. So I have the M2 12.9-inch iPad Pro, but it's the base model with the base storage. So I think that means it has less RAM than the larger storage options. That doesn't seem to matter. You can have loads of tracks running and it's so responsive. It plays back straight away. You can mess around with things while it's playing back. I've wanted, as you may know, Apple to do something with these M1 and M2 chips for a long time, and finally we're starting to see what they're capable of. This is deeply impressive, although you might be wondering, who's it for? You know, does it suit a certain genre of music more than another? Apple wants to promote this for all types of music creation, and so far, even though I haven't dug into audio recording, I can see where they're coming from. I've spent several evenings on the sofa with just the iPad and a pair of headphones and just noodled away creating little loops and 8-bar pieces of music, and it's really inspiring. That is the point with this, the fact that there's no barriers really. You don't have to have all this stuff. You can just take your iPad, plug a pair of headphones in and start making music. But now it's over to you guys, because this is just my first reaction to Logic Pro on the iPad. I want to do a lot more content on this, but I'd like to know what you want to see. So let me know in the comments, and equally, if you've been using Logic Pro on the iPad, what do you think? And if you've still got some time, keep watching for a link to my video where I reveal my first impressions of Final Cut Pro on the iPad. Trust me, you do not want to miss that one.